Hi guys. Today I'm going to be talking about the dialectical tensions perspective. This perspective was developed by um, Leslie Baxter and Barbara Montgomery. And main idea behind the dialectical perspective is that contradictions are simply an inherent part of our relationship. Um, I think that in our culture, in the United States, we often think of relationships that take work or that involve conflict as being bad or that means something is wrong. I have some pretty strong feelings about romantic comedies and the message that those types of movies teach us about what relationships should look like. But this theory says that that's incorrect, that we shouldn't think that relationships that take work, that relationships that have conflict, that those types of relationships are bad. The theory says that, in fact, all relationships take work, all relationships have contradictions and tensions and conflict, and that it's through the working through those conflicts and managing those tensions that relationships actually evolve and grow. And in essence, that's what relationships are. The dialectical perspective argues that within relationships, there are three major tensions. Additional tensions are discussed and have been developed, but the three original tensions are what I'd like to discuss in this lecture slide today. And so this theory suggests that regardless of whether you're talking about a romantic relationship or friendship or any other type of family relationship, these types of tensions can occur. Our first tension is called autonomy versus connectedness. So let's take a minute just first of all to kind of define what that means. Autonomy refers to independence or being alone, have your own freedom or personal space. On the other hand, of course, connectedness refers to being connected, being close to another, having intimacy with another person. So the autonomy versus connectedness tension deals with one's desire to both have space and independence, but also have connection with another person. You can imagine when you take two people together and you think about how they may have different needs at different times, that certainly can create a tension. It's possible that sometimes I have a very strong need for autonomy and I want my space, and at that very same time, my partner may be craving connection and wanting to be together. So no doubt that can create kind of a tension. Right? Okay, next we have novelty versus predictability. Novelty, of course, refers to when things are new and unique and exciting and different. Predictability, on the other hand, refers to stability, certainty, knowing what to expect. Individuals, at least according to this theory, have a desire for both novelty and predictability. And then again, within a couple, it's possible that one member of the dyad may prioritize novelty, while another individual may prioritize predictability. So again, no doubt a tension can arise from those two kind of differing or maybe even competing desires. And then the third tension that dialectical perspective argues is really a part of all relationships is disclosure versus privacy. Disclosure refers to being open, having candor, feeling free to discuss any and all matters, whereas privacy refers to having some constraint and having it being closed off to some things and keeping some things private. Again, the theory says that individuals have the desire for both of these things, even though they can be competing needs. And when you have two people together, two people might have different views about, which need to prioritize, whether that's disclosure or privacy. So the theory highlights these major tensions that occur within relationships, but it doesn't leave us hanging, right? It then goes on to suggest, well, what relationships are it's how we manage those tensions. It's how we work through those tensions. I don't think this theory would ever say that the goal is ever to just automatically solve the tensions. I think the theory would say that maybe not possible. But instead, what we need to look at is just how do we manage these tensions. And so this slide identifies various ways to manage tensions. The theory refers to these as praxis patterns. And what you'll see is that even though I've identified a variety of strategies, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're all good or effective strategies. Really, as we kind of work our way down the list, we'll see that the strategies become more and more effective. That doesn't mean that they get easier. In many cases, it's really hard to implement some of the strategies that are particularly effective. But let's take a look at each one of these a little bit more closely. All right, so the first praxis pattern I have on the list is denial. Denial occurs, essentially when an individual in the relationship denies that any kind of tension or any type of competing desires exists. So let's say that you and your romantic partner are kind of experiencing the autonomy and connection tension, and you are craving a little bit of more autonomy and space, and your partner is craving a little bit more connection or closeness. And perhaps when you ask for your space, your partner just kind of ignores that, or pretends like that it's really not an issue and does not address your desire for autonomy. That's really denial, right? Pretending like no tension exists. So we can see, as I said earlier, that's not a particularly effective strategy. Next, we have disorientation. Disorientation is kind of like that expression, damned if you do and damned if you don't. Maybe you've heard that expression before. It feels like you're in kind of a no-win situation. Another way to describe disorientation might be to say that you feel like you're caught between like a rock and a hard place. Again, that expresses this idea that although you're acknowledging these two different options, or these two different competing needs exist, you're kind of saying, well, there's nothing I can do about it. I'll give you kind of a couple of personal examples about this. Again, admitting that I know that this is not a really effective strategy. So let me see here. I want to talk a little bit about my mother-in-law, who is a really great person. She really is. And I generally have a positive relationship with, but I do have a little bit of a tension going on here. So my mother-in-law lives in a different state from us, so we just don't get to see her as much as I would like, or I think as much as my children would like. But here's where it gets a little bit tricky. On one hand, I would like to kind of really be open about that. Now that my mother-in-law has been recently retired, I'd like to kind of say, you have some more free time. Would you be willing to come visit? Why aren't you, coming to hang out a little bit more often? But on the other hand, I honestly kind of feel like she should just want to, and I shouldn't have to bring it up. Right? So I've kind of got myself caught here, or at least I'm telling myself I'm caught between a rock and a hard place. I'm telling myself if I bring it up and I'm really open about it, then I didn't really accomplish what I was wanting to accomplish anyway, her wanting to be here. And I've also risked now the relationship's kind of awkward, right, and uncomfortable. Yet on the other hand, by not bringing it up, I am kind of continuing to allow myself to kind of be unhappy, or kind of allowing this issue to continue, right? So that's kind of an example of disorientation, where I feel like, well, geez, I can't bring it up because this has a negative outcome, but if I do bring it up, then it has another different negative outcome. Okay, that's disorientation. Third on the list is, which is a little bit more effective here, we're moving into strategies that work a little bit better, spiraling alternation. So spiraling alternation occurs essentially when you kind of alternate between the different tensions based on time. So let's say you were thinking about the holidays and you were trying to figure out who to spend the holiday with, and whether you wanted to maybe be by yourself or you wanted to be with your in-laws or vice versa. Spiraling alternation would be some kind of strategy where you said, well, all right, we'll spend Thanksgiving with this group, and then we'll spend Christmas on our own, and then we'll spend next year Thanksgiving on our own, but then we'll spend Christmas with this group, and back and forth and back and forth. And that's, I think, a kind of a common strategy that a lot of times people use. Of course, it comes with both positives and negatives, but that's how we would define spiraling alternation. Segmentation is another form of kind of alternating, but segmentation is kind of like alternating more based on topic. And so this particular practice pattern is really common when we're talking about the disclosure versus privacy tension. And so maybe in your relationship, you find that there are some topics that you and your partner can agree you can be completely open about and really favor the disclosure side of things. Maybe you can be completely open about your finances, or you feel comfortable talking about everything there is to talk about when it comes to, I don't know, future children that you might have or something like that. On the other hand, you agree that other topics, when you discuss them, maybe you'll have a little bit more restraint or a little bit more candor, right? That maybe topics related to, I don't know, other family members or other things in your past might be a little bit off limits. So you're kind of alternating based on disclosure and based on privacy, but that kind of alternating is related to the different topics. All right. Balance is next. Balance essentially is a fancy word your book used for compromise and trying to find some kind of 50-50 strategy and some way of kind of meeting in the middle. I typically don't use this word on an exam or don't use this word too much for assignments because I kind of argue that really a number of the strategies that we're talking about here are examples of compromise. And so I feel like this balance strategy is just a little bit vague and can be a little bit confusing. So I've included it because it's mentioned in your text, but I wouldn't really expect to see that on the exam. Instead, I want to kind of focus on the more specific ones. So we're down to the last 3 practice patterns. I'd argue that these 3 patterns are in some ways sometimes the hardest to implement, but they're probably the 3 most effective strategies. So let's take a look at them a little bit more closely here. First, we have integration. So if balance is like trying to find a 50-50 compromise, integration is trying to find a 100% or a win-win solution. So integration involves not having to really have either side give in, but instead trying to find a way where both sides get their needs met, in full, right? And so, you can imagine that it can just be really tricky, and that can kind of be hard to figure out and can really take a lot of energy and effort and creativity. But let me try to give you an example here. It's actually from when I was in graduate school, and it really took me a while to kind of think through what was happening when I saw this. But in hindsight, I think it's really a great example of integration. So when I was in graduate school, it wasn't uncommon for me and some of my other some of the other graduate students to go to our advisor's house to work on some of our research projects or work on our research with him. Now, he happened to be married to another professor in the department, and so she also was often working on her own research. The couple, my advisor and his wife, had 2 relatively small children that they were also trying to parent while they were, working their full-time jobs. And so I remember one weekend when we went over there, that we were working on our project, and my advisor was there, and his wife was there, and their children were there, and then also the babysitter was there. And I thought, well, this is very strange. Both parents are here, but there's a babysitter. I thought, well, obviously it's kind of a luxury to be able to afford a babysitter and be able to do that. But I just thought, well, this is kind of weird. Well, as the day progressed, we would work on our research and we would be very busy. But then every once in a while, one of the children would run in and have something exciting to share. Or, after working for so long, we would take a break and my advisor would kind of go and interact and play with his kids a little bit. And it finally kind of occurred to me that this was, I think, really my advisor and his wife's attempt to find integration, right? On one hand, they needed some autonomy. They both needed space and they both had work that needed to get done. But on the other hand, they wanted connection. They didn't want to have to give up their whole weekend and be away from their kids and their family and miss out on all of that, connection. And so by hiring the babysitter, even when they were around, I think they were able to try to find this way of having both autonomy and connection almost simultaneously. Okay, so that's one example of integration. I'm hopeful that you're kind of thinking through maybe some additional examples in your own personal experiences. Next, let's look at recalibration. Recalibration basically refers to the idea of like rethinking about something, or maybe a better way to say it would be like to reframe the situation, right? And so it might be where you initially thought something was a problem or was an issue, but you kind of reframed it or you rethought about it. And so you were able to actually view it as a positive thing when you kind of rethought about the situation, right? So let me give you an example here. Again, I guess it happens to be autonomy and connection tension, but let's see. I think I've mentioned before that I grew up in Indiana and now, I'm living in Michigan, and I'm about 5 hours away from the hometown where I grew up in and where my mother still lives. And so it's not uncommon for my mom to mention that she wishes we were closer and that we could see each other more often, and some of those types of things. And so I get that and I can appreciate that, but sometimes what we will be able to do is kind of sit down and have a conversation and say, well, now wait a minute. Part of the reason why I am in Michigan and I have an older sister that's in Florida, and part of the reason why we're far away is because you raised us to be able to be strong and independent and capable and create our own kind of independent lives. And so would you really want us having to rely on you and maybe even live under your own roof? Of course not, right? It's a really great thing that you taught us and raised us in a way that we can kind of go out and have successful lives, even if that means it's a little farther away than you had hoped. Okay, so again, recalibration is really just simply trying to reframe the tension and rethink about it, maybe not so much as a negative, but as a positive. Finally, we have reaffirmation. And reaffirmation, I think, really just kind of is best described as this idea of, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, right? Or, as my mom always said, it builds character. And so with reaffirmation, what you're kind of doing is you're kind of saying, okay, we have this tension, but guess what? If we can work through it, if we can figure it out together, our relationship is actually even better and even stronger than if we had not experienced the tension or the frustration in the first place. Right? So the tension itself isn't the problem, but now that we've experienced the tension and that we've worked through the tension, the way we handled it actually is what's important. And if we're able to actually manage this tension and still maintain the relationship, then we're even better off than if we had not had the tension before or had the tension at all. Okay, so hopefully those kind of brief definitions of each practice pattern make sense, and maybe even you are thinking through some of the various tensions that might be occurring or have occurred in your own relationships, and you're kind of able to relate these concepts back to your own personal experiences. With that being said, Okay, so at this point, I'm going to assume that you've had a chance to read through each example and think about what tension is occurring and how you would manage that tension, which practice pattern you would use. So I just want to take a few minutes to kind of walk through some of these. So in the first example, we're seeing a situation where you and your mother have a difference of opinions about how Sunday afternoons should work. She would like you to hang out with the entire family and have dinner. You would like to spend the afternoon at a friend's house watching the football game. I'd argue that probably the most explicit tension that's occurring here is autonomy versus connection, right? Your mom wants you all to be together, wants you to be connected. You want some space and some independence. So that's what we would label that tension. Now we need to think about, well, what would you do, right? How would you manage the tension? When we do this example in class, probably the most common example I hear is spiraling alternation, right? People tend to argue that what they would do would be they'd spend one Sunday at grandma's and then the next Sunday with a friend. Or maybe even they would spend the first half at grandma's and then the second half with a friend. You can see what that involves is alternating based along each continuum, of the tension. Autonomy, then connection. Autonomy, then connection. And it seems feasible that that would work. I encourage you also to think about, though, some of those practice patterns that were a little bit further down the list. Is there a way that you could create a win-win situation here? Is there a way where you might be able to use, the integration strategy to make both parties happy and kind of have autonomy and connection kind of coexist? I think if we were creative about that, we certainly can come up with some examples. Okay, but let's look at number 2. The second example involves you and your romantic relation experiencing a tension between how much information gets disclosed. Your romantic partner would like you to share everything because she feels like that will help build the relationship and establish trust. You're not ready to do that, and you would like to have some things remain private. So obviously, I hope that you identified this as the disclosure versus privacy tension. There are probably a variety of ways to manage this tension. The first one that comes to my mind is this idea perhaps of recalibration. Remember, that is a practice pattern that involves kind of reframing or rethinking about the situation. I wonder if you could argue with your partner, not argue with your partner, but you talked to your partner and you were able to kind of say something to the effect of, sharing stuff and learning about each other is just one of the neatest parts of relationships, and that you value that so much you don't want to maybe rush through it until you feel comfortable. And the idea that you can do that over the long amount of time, and you can do that as the relationship kind of progresses, and that actually having exciting things to share even as you continue on with the relationship down the road is something that's really important to you, and actually is means that you value the relationship even more than versus if you didn't. I think that kind of conversation really is an example of reframing or recalibrating. Perhaps you came up with some other examples as well, okay, or other practice patterns as well. Our third example says, or it's about you and your family and how you celebrate Christmas. It says that you have always celebrated Christmas with one way, but due to a variety of family circumstances, including a new nephew, a relocation, and a new brother-in-law, that it will be difficult to continue the same traditions. And so I think we could pretty easily argue that the tension that's occurring here is novelty versus predictability. And so you may have come up with a whole host of different strategies for how to maintain this. Again, I think you could maybe look at spiraling alternation. That might involve alternating years for how you celebrate the holiday, but maybe you were also able to come up with some other strategies as well. Okay, so hopefully at this point you feel comfortable with the idea of dialectical tensions. You can identify the 3 different tensions and describe those, and you can also identify various practice patterns and provide some examples of each one of those.